Hello again, everyone. We're back with yet another unit. They just keep coming. This time, as you see, tradition and change in East Asia. We'll be talking primarily about the rise of China and Japan in the early modern period, as historians often refer to these years, these centuries, roughly between 15 and 1800. I've put scenic pictures of some of the beauty of China and Japan in between each slide. So if you see slides that are blank, at least no text and just pictures, you're not missing anything. It's just my attempt to beautify this. We're going to start with Japan. As you see here, the unification of Japan taking place within the time frame that we just established. According to Professor Bentley, our lovable textbook author, during the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the political unification of Japan ended in an extended period of civil disorder. The Tokugawa Shoguns, the family name, sought to lay a foundation for long-term political and social stability, and they provided generous support for Neo-Confucian studies in an effort to promote traditional values. Neo-Confucian, meaning coming from the Chinese philosopher in the ancient world, Confucius. And we'll see in this lecture and others later on that China has a huge impact culturally on many of its Asian neighbors, including Japan. So Neo-Confucian studies means that the updated, newer version of Confucius thinking and philosophy is taken in by Japan as well. But before this period, before this unification, for a long period of time throughout the Middle Ages, for instance, Japan was a decentralized place, meaning there was no one overarching government. There was an emperor, but the emperor was often unable to keep all kinds of regional lords, warlords, the daimyo as they are known. We'll use the term daimyo again, sort of the equivalent of, say, European nobles. And the nobles in Japan were making alliances with each other, turning against each other, but fighting it out for power. But on the whole, throughout the Middle Ages, nobody achieved power, at least for any length of time. So Japan remained divided between all of these regional lords. And even though it's somewhat thin and spread out too much, the map on the bottom, and it's going the wrong way, north to south. North is usually up and south down, of course. If you rotate this to the left, it would be basically the shape of Japan as you see it on the globe or map. But each one of those shaded regional areas is the domain and the territory of a regional lord or nobleman, a daimyo. And so Japan was not united before the Tokugawa Shogunate that we're going to get into in more detail here. So they're moving away from what you see on this map, however, gradually, and unifying, however, incompletely. The big event that sort of started this process is the Battle of Shekigahara in 1600. Nice rounded off date there for us. But daimyo from east and west, daimyo from the east allied with one another, daimyo from the west allied with one another, supporting different leaders and in a succession crisis, meaning there'd been an attempt to unify and it had been somewhat successful to centralize power. It had been somewhat successful, but at that warlord, that shogun's death, civil war breaks out again because now different daimyos, different lords are supporting one or another to kind of take the former leader's place. Japan's history in this period and before the in the Middle Ages, and then in the early modern period, just like China's, is remarkably complicated. All of these political factions warring back and forth, power often decentralized, sometimes centralized for a short time, and then going away and getting another configuration after that. So there's a succession crisis. The major lords or daimyo split into roughly two factions, east and west. And Ieyasu Tokugawa, the leader of the family at that time, was the victor at this battle in 1600 after a huge fight with around 100,000 troops fighting for each side on the given day. October 21st, I think 1600, if my memory serves. Some gunpowder weapons were used, so they were already importing weapons through trade relations with Europe. And as I said at the outset, this battle led to the formation of the Tokugawa Shogunate. That's beautiful. The Tokugawa Shogunate lasted for some 250 plus years, from 1600 to 1868. So there had been shoguns before. Really, shogun is a word for military warlord, or warlord that comes from a sort of a noble background. So strong men, but strong men that came from nobility. This was already the political reality of Japan before the Tokugawa Shogunate. What changes here is that, number one, it stays in this family for quite some time, and partly because of that, but for other reasons we'll explore as well, they are able to centralize power and organize power and unify the country in a way that it hadn't been done before. As Peter von Sivers says in Patterns of World History, which I've quoted off and on before in other units, that this marked the beginning of Japan's most peaceful, most secluded, and perhaps most thoroughly regulated and policed interval in its long history. Breaking precedent, the Tokugawas, the family in question here, would create a hereditary shogunate, meaning it's passed down from family member to family member, father to son to grandson, organized along Chinese Neo-Confucian models of morality and government that would last until 1868. So yet again, the reference to Chinese Neo-Confucian models, that Confucianism is a lot about morality and also about sort of harmony in society, what we kind of call order. So not a surprise that Confucius would be picked up by other, neighboring peoples. Confucius had a great deal to offer through his wise, brilliant career and writings. As Professor Mason says in a fairly recent history of Japan, by 1700, so a little bit later than what was said in the first couple of quotes here, it was no longer feasible for any group of daimyo, again, lords, nobles, to foment rebellion. Long periods of cohabitation in Edo, a city which was the birthplace and childhood of most of the domainal lords, meaning they have their own regional domain, which you saw on the map, as well as the scene of their later compulsory residences, doubtless created all kinds of informal bonds and similarities of outlook among them and between them and ranking members of the Tokugawa lineage. So what's being said there, to sort of unpack this for you, is that the Tokugawa were quite clever, forcing the daimyo, who are the daimyo are the major potential threat to Tokugawa power, because we've just seen that for centuries, going back to the Middle Ages, it's one daimyo or one group of daimyo fighting another back and forth in shifting alliances and relations. So if you're a leader in Japan and you plan to take power unto yourself and unify the country by force, centralize it, you've got to find a way to bring the daimyo to heel, whether by force, threat of force, or making deals with them. You've got to find some way to do it. And one of the ways that he did this, which is similar to what a European king did around this same time, Ieyasu Tokugawa, but then his descendants after that, was to force the daimyo to live, not all the time, but much of the time, at the capital in Edo, what's now Tokyo. And he could keep a watchful eye over them there. But then being in the capital all the time, they were kind of, in a sense, forced kind of through peer pressure and status anxiety, because they're next to so many other daimyo day after day, to spend all kinds of money and time sort of thinking about their clothing, anything that would keep them from spending on weapons and military units back home in their regional province in Japan. More on that in a while. So Ieyasu Tokugawa, the one of a long line of warlords, but the one who first effectively unified and centralized Japan, again through force. He won the battle in 1600, which started this process. He had to either take, as Professor Mason says, the final steps which would ensure the supremacy of himself and his sons, or face the prospect that jealous rivals, guys that wanted his position, daimyo, all, would wait for a chance to humble the Tokugawa forever. Authority won by arms, meaning military might, had been the basis of every system of political control since the various acts of submission of the court aristocracy in the 12th century, which is the Middle Ages. Tokugawa rulers certainly did not break any new ground in the way they achieved power, nor were they unusual in the steps they took to shift the source of power from the battlefield to the palace, the castle, and the council chamber, and in general to convert a position of mere might into one more decently clothed in ideas of right. So might making right. This is another way to say that the Tokugawa leaders here see the importance of legitimization. If you don't have legitimacy as a government, as a ruler, it's harder to make your rule work and be effective, and it may cause it to collapse. If you come in just as a military conqueror with just brute force and you don't really have any other claim, on the throne or on control of government, it's tougher to get people to go along. So what the Tokugawa are doing is, after they win, the hard way through bloodshed, now they try to legitimize themselves and do things in a more peaceful, sort of orderly, law-abiding way, or at least they make the laws that force everyone else to abide. But it helps to make them look a bit more gentle and a bit more legitimate. Ieyasu was a seemingly ordinary guy, again from Professor Mason's book, but he seemed to be able to rise to the occasion. So he would come up big in the clutch. He had to distinguish himself in warfare as well as statecraft. Statecraft means politics, diplomacy. Ambition never led him astray, however. On the contrary, self-control and a truly marvelous patience stamped his character from childhood. So he might not have been brilliant, is what this is really saying, but he was sort of very common sense oriented and had a lot of maybe not too dramatic qualities, but important qualities for leadership nonetheless. Self-control is hard to come by for all human beings, and especially for powerful leaders. And being patient isn't easy for any of us either. Both of those are things that we don't actually usually, they don't spring to mind immediately when we think of good leadership, because again, it's sort of none too sexy to think of leadership that way. But this guy was a straightforward, solid, common sense leader, had good judgment. The power of the shoguns from this time forward started to increase as they took the reins of government into their hands and started to think and act and make policy to affect and control all of Japan, or as much of it as possible. Mason again saying the great and abiding importance of the office of shogun lay in the amount of effective control it conferred on its holders. Whoever held it, the shogunate, possessed a right to command which would extend, if need be, to each man, woman, or child in the country, and to every hectare of land in the country. The Tokugawa shoguns were all formally nominated to their position by the emperor. What? I'll get back to that. In other words, in form and constitutional theory, they ruled Japan not in their own sovereign right, but because the emperor had called on them to do so. From the outset, they were supposed to be guardians of the nation under the guidance and at least what appeared to be the overlordship of the emperor. So there was an emperor at all times during this period, going all the way back again to the Middle Ages. But in the era of the shoguns, these hundreds of years we're talking about, the shoguns effectively moved the emperors aside, and they were the real rulers, the real decision makers, because they had the armies, they had the might, the military muscle, controlled the economy, and the emperor, they didn't kill the emperor, they didn't imprison the emperors, they still showed respect for them, but they did basically rule, instead of the emperors. The emperor, more or less during the shogunate, not just the Tokugawa shogunate, but the ones before that, as sort of a puppet leader, kind of a ceremonial leader. But why didn't they just get rid of them if they're not making the decisions anyway? Because the people not only respected the Japanese emperor, but, and this would be true even into the 20th century, the people respected the emperor as a godlike figure. And so the shogun was always wise to at least make it look like he was doing as the emperor told, or at least respecting him thoroughly. And so it did give the emperors a little bit of power, since they had the ability to sway public opinion. They didn't call it that in those days, but and they were such revered, again, quasi-godlike figures. But the real day-to-day policy-making power, war-making power, taxing power was in the hands of the shoguns. But the shoguns were, in a sense, sort of de facto rulers, and at least in by the letter of the law, they were ruling. They were the employees of the emperor, but the power really worked the other way. The reasons for that, how it all came about, we don't really have time for. It's something that you'd pick up in the first half of this world history course, world history before, prior to 1500. Edo as the center of Tokugawa rule. By 1700, right in the middle of our period here, the population of Edo, or what would become later Tokyo, was already around 1 million people, which may have made it the largest city in the world. I think it probably was. Professor Mason, again, who I'm relying on heavily here so far, the Tokugawa or Bakufu government, which means Bakufu means tent government, because it was supposed to be temporary at first, for reasons we won't get into as well, and the name kind of stuck, even when it's clear that it wasn't temporary. It wasn't going to ever be, it wasn't going to be temporary. It was going to stay. I almost said it was never going to be temporary, but that doesn't make sense. But this government set up its headquarters in Edo on the Kanto Plain, in time creating metropolis out of what had been just a fishing village surrounded by marshland. So the Tokugawa leadership basically put Edo, or what became Tokyo, on the map. It wasn't a sprawling city until they sort of made it their center of operations. He goes on to write, Edo ranked as the foremost center of consumption, not only in Japan, but in the world. The truly astonishing diversification of trade and manufacture can be gained or gleaned from documents such as the official permission to form a trading federation of 24 Osaka, another city in Japan, trade guilds. So there's kind of like a business license that these trade guilds got from the government. And in the documentation that, of course, are primary source documents, we see among the goods handled by these trading companies, ashes, baskets, books, carpenter squares, charcoal boxes, clogs, clothes boxes, copper, cotton goods, cotton wool, dried fish, drugs. So it's like an inventory of all the things that they trade and deal in. Face powder, fertilizers, grindstones, hemp, incense, iron, nails, ivory. Getting tired of this yet? Oils, paints, paper, parasols, porcelain, I'm tired. Sandals, seaweed, socks, straw mats, tobacco, umbrellas, wax, and wire. Get the picture. Edo was a place where there was a great amount of market activity, a great amount of economic activity taking place, along with the gigantic population, and also it being sort of the political center of Japan during this Tokugawa Shogunate. The daimyo under the shogunate, right? These are the lords. They're basically kind of come from the same background as the Tokugawa family themselves. They're used to being big shots in their particular region of Japan, the rough equivalent of French dukes or British lords at around the same time. But remember, it's this group that anybody who wants to centralized power in their own hands is going to have to deal with, because they're traditionally powerful as well. They're wealthy. They can raise armies and usually have in the past. So you're going to have to find a way, if you want to rule, to get them to acquiesce. So Professor Bentley writes, from the castle town of Edo, modern Tokyo, the shogun governed his personal domain and sought to extend his control to the daimyo. The shoguns instituted the policy of alternate attendance, and this is, I already talked about this, but I'll read it anyway, which required daimyo to maintain their families at Edo and spend every other year at the Tokugawa court. This policy allowed the shoguns to keep an eye on the daimyo, and as a side effect, it encouraged daimyo to spend their money on lavish residences and comfortable lives in Edo rather than investing it in military forces that can challenge the bakufu, the government. I mentioned a few minutes ago that this is similar to something a European king did, and one we've already met, and that was Louis XIV. If you remember, he used the Palace of Versailles for similar purposes. He forced the nobility to live much of the time at the courts and Palace of Versailles, so you keep them, the nobles are the equivalent of the daimyo, so you keep them under his watchful eye, keep them from plotting against him behind his back, and also sort of got them diverted into all kinds of trivial pursuits as Louis was making decisions, political decisions, without them elsewhere in the palace. And that's more or less what the Tokugawa shoguns are doing here. So, and they weren't learning this from each other. Louis didn't learn it from the Tokugawa or vice versa. They seem to have sort of adopted this strategy for wielding power on their own in different parts of the world at roughly the same time. Foreign policy under the shogunates. We start to see a big issue arise during this period about what to do with regard to European traders and merchants and missionaries coming to Japan and China. We saw that the Indian Ocean trade, at least in the Indian Ocean area, Japan and China, of course, were involved in the Indian Ocean trade, but their lands were somewhat away from it. But that the Indian princes on the coastline, as far away as Malaya, the east coast of Africa, those areas were not able to fend off the Europeans, even though they tried to, the Portuguese and the Spanish first, then the Dutch. Japan and China have a little more ability to do that, and will continue to, though in the end, for at least a long chunk of time, we'll see even these two more powerful kingdoms and countries are subject to European dominance as well. But this wasn't established for a long time, and we start to see this being a real point of division within Japanese society, and we'll see the same in Chinese society. Professor Bentley tells us that during the 1630s, the shoguns issued a series of edicts, which means laws. An edict is a law just proclaimed by the emperor or the leader. Doesn't have to pass a Congress and get a majority vote. He just says, this is a law, and signs it. Kind of like an executive order today. A series of edicts sharply restricting Japanese relations with other lands that remained in effect for some 2 centuries. They expelled Europeans from Japan, more or less, and prohibited foreign merchants from trading in Japanese ports. That had been after close to a century of trading with the Europeans, though the trade had been limited in terms of its size and limited to only certain countries. At least there were some that were favored over others. In 1640, one of the favored countries, a Portuguese merchant ship, arrived at Nagasaki. This is after the edicts that sharply restricted trade, in hopes of engaging in trade in spite of the ban. Officials, shogunate officials, beheaded 61 of the crew on that Portuguese ship, spared 13 of them so they could go back home to their Portuguese friends and family and other Europeans and tell them of the experience, so that they'd go home and say, oh my God, this was a massacre. We better be careful there. So this was carefully thought out, but it's clear that the Japanese government, the shogunate, meant business. And Europeans certainly did listen to this. Not that they still didn't try to trade to some degree, but they did so with, being much more careful, as you might expect. Authorities gradually loosened the restrictions over the decades and centuries, and the policy never led to complete isolation of Japan from the outside world. But you can see here, as we'll see in China, that it becomes a gigantic issue about how much should we trade with the Europeans, how much should we invite them into our society, how much should we let their Christian missionaries come in and convert at least some of our people, even if it's a small number, to Christianity? Should we allow trade with Europe at all? Should we allow Christianity in at all? Should we isolate ourselves entirely from the European world and much of the outer world to preserve our own traditions and our own traditional way of life? Because they could see, which is true, that the more you start sort of becoming cosmopolitan and not just trading with, but sharing ideas and learning about other people's, they're coming into your ports and vice versa, the more there's a tendency for your culture to be watered down and drift in other directions, or have, it leaves sort of its traditional moorings. The Japanese, at least many of them, were quite concerned about this. Though it was a debate, this was controversial, so there were some Japanese leaders and daimyo that were in favor of European trade and Christianity, and sort of still engaging with the outer world, and there were those that had sort of the more conservative, traditional approach. Economic and social change in early modern Japan. Back to Bentley again. Oh, I'm sorry, von Sivers again. Then on to Bentley. The shogunate declared that the jati system in India, the members of the officially recognized classes. I'm sorry. Let me start again. The shogunate declared that, like the jati system in India, the members of the officially recognized classes in Japan, daimyo, samurai, peasants, artisans, merchants, basically in that order, top down. The merchants, at least at first, were at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, at least among those that are listed here. The samurai, by the way, you might expect to have played a larger role here, but the samurai were being domesticated quite a bit by this time, intentionally by the Tokugawa Shogunate. So they weren't fighting battles as much anymore as they used to, because they were too much of a force for unrest when they had in the past. Though it's certainly a fascinating history, the history of the development of the samurai. Once Japan was stable, as Professor Bentley tells us, the interest of the Tokugawa authorities, the government, was to reduce the numbers of armed professional warriors, samurai. So they pushed the daimyo and samurai to become bureaucrats, government functionaries, and even to turn their talents to scholarship, become professors, philosophers, teachers. The samurai had quite a bit of status. They're kind of like lower nobility. The daimyo are the upper nobility. And so you couldn't just kind of, say don't fight any longer and now you can be homeless, but they're trying to kind of nudge them in the direction of respectable careers, but peaceful ones. Bentley also adds merchants in Japan became increasingly wealthy. They were at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder to start at the start of this period, or close to it, but they start to change that. By becoming increasingly wealthy and prominent, Japanese cities flourished throughout the Tokugawa era, and merchants prospered handsomely in the vibrant urban environment or environments, not just Edo, but Nagasaki and Kyoto, Osaka. All these places became major economic centers. Rice dealers, pawnbrokers, and sake merchants soon controlled more wealth than the ruling elites. And once that happens, once the what we might call the rising capitalist classes, once that happens, the ruling elites, the daimyo, are kind of in trouble. At least the handwriting's on the wall. They're eventually going to be in trouble. This also is something that's similar to happens in Europe as well. And we've already traced this sort of same conflict that goes on for centuries and will continue to go on as ever so slowly, both in Europe and here in East Asia. The old-fashioned nobility is losing ground to the rising merchant class, banker class, businessman class, who are becoming increasingly wealthy. Ongoing Chinese influence. We talked a little bit about this already. Von Sivers says that the Tokugawa adopted Neo-Confucianism as the governing ideology, meaning Confucian thought was sort of the backbone of government philosophy, thus joining, which is what Confucianism was partly about, thus joining the Commonwealth of Confucian religious civilizations in the region. Confucianism is a very interesting body of thought and work. It's not just Confucius himself. Neo-Confucianism implies that others after Confucius's death and even long after were still contributing writings and ideas to Confucianist thought. So it's like a school of thought started by Confucius that continues through the centuries. But it's interesting and complex because it's kind of a religion and it's kind of a philosophy. It's kind of both at one and the same time. Its long-established precepts, quoting von Sivers again, of filial piety. It's been a long day, folks. Filial piety, which means respect for ancestors, which is a huge part of Chinese civilization's religious thinking and Confucian thought. Models of ethical behavior and unswerving loyalty to the government were incorporated into the new law codes. So this is quite directly and in many ways quite specifically taking Confucian ideas and making them the backbone of the law. And Confucius was all about order and harmony in society and establishing laws and ethical behavior, respect for elders, ancestors being part of it, that help to create and maintain such order and harmony. Bentley adds, even with Tokugawa sponsorship, Neo-Confucianism did not dominate intellectual life in Japan. Although most scholars recognized Japan's debt to Chinese intellectual traditions, some sought to establish a sense of Japanese identity that did not depend on cultural kinship with China. Particularly during the 18th century, scholars of native learning scorned Neo-Confucianism and even Buddhism as alien cultural imports and emphasized instead the importance of, strictly Japanese folk traditions and the indigenous Shinto religion. The original indigenous religion of Japan is not Buddhism, it's Shinto. So it's not just Confucius or Confucian thought that influenced Japan, it's Buddhist thought and the Buddhist religion. And there are many other ways that China influenced Japan as well. But this quote from Professor Bentley is telling us that there was a backlash, and there were plenty of Japanese leaders, political leaders, and cultural leaders who were quite concerned about too much Chinese influence, and they were looking to sort of turn it back and say, no, we need to be more proud of our own traditions, and we need to sort of keep them in place, and we can't do that if we keep allowing and encouraging this Chinese influence through Confucianism, Buddhism, and other cultural artifacts. Floating worlds and urban culture. The centers of Tokugawa urban culture or the Yukio, or floating worlds, which were entertainment and pleasure quarters, which means parts of towns, or tea houses, theaters, brothels, and public baths offered escape from social responsibilities and the rigid rules of conduct that governed public behavior. That, according to Professor Mason in his History of Japan. One of the most well-known Japanese cultural figures of this era, Ihara Saikuku, a poet, sort of hit the nail on the head. His poems were about this kind of urban culture, as Mason says about Saikuku, that he took as his main themes the two great concerns of the impermanent floating world, money and erotic love. He treated them in a witty, anecdotal, and thoroughly realistic manner that still provides good reading even today. His stories about how to make or lose money are convincing sketches of contemporary city life, full of humorous allusions and local color. So Saikuku was kind of the poet that really, using language, gives us a sense of this type of culture, where you can see many Japanese feeling a need to, again, escape, at least for a time, social responsibilities and all the many pressures in everyday life and society. This brings us to a European, Francis Xavier, and a Jesuit priest who became famous by his exploits in Asia, China as well. And this is the Christian influence. So a Jesuit priest doing missionary activity. Bentley says the Jesuit Francis Xavier traveled to Japan in 1549, so a little bit before our period here, and opened a mission to seek converts to Christianity. among the Japanese population, of course. Jesuits experienced remarkable success in Japan. Several powerful daimyo adopted Christianity and ordered their subjects in their regions that they had great influence to do likewise. Although Christians were only a tiny minority of the Japanese population, the popularity of Christianity generated a backlash among government officials and moralists seeking to preserve Japanese religion and cultural traditions. Buddhist and Confucian scholars resented the Christian conviction that their faith was the only true doctrine. You can see why. The Christians are coming along saying you have to give up your gods and your religion because ours is the right one. So this understandably rubbed a lot of feathers the wrong way. But the fact that they wouldn't have gotten so much backlash from at least some of the population if they hadn't seen that an alarming number, though still a minority, did take to Christianity. So here is yet another example of sort of this back and forth ongoing struggle between Japanese traditionalists and those who want to open up to kind of the larger cosmopolitan outlook and world. The shoguns promulgated several decrees, again, laws, ordering a halt to Christian missions and commanding Japanese Christians to renounce their faith. In 1612, the shoguns began rigorous enforcement of these policies and decrees, edicts. They tortured and executed European missionaries. The campaign was so effective, Christianity survived only as a secret religion. And a smaller one than it had been, and it was always small to begin with. They killed and tortured thousands of Christians. So this was sheer brutality, but it did more or less put a stop to the foreign influence, at least in terms of religion. The Portuguese and Dutch influence. The Europeans traded off and on with Japan, and we'll see China as well. But the Portuguese and Dutch, at least at times, had kind of unique relationships and to some degree favored relationships, which it sounds kind of strange. But keep in mind that the Portuguese and the Dutch were among the first European countries to get into the Indian Ocean trade. So there are more obscure European countries to us today, but the French and the English came to this area a little bit later. The Germans even later than that. So that's why you see sort of these two groups. The Portuguese transformed neither the economy nor the religious life of the country to which they came, Japan. Direct trade between Europe and Japan was not important in the 16th century at all. However, the Portuguese found that what the Japanese really wanted from abroad, from overseas, were Chinese silk fabrics. Thus, the Portuguese conducted an extremely profitable carrying trade, which means they didn't bring products from Europe because the Japanese didn't want them. What they did was sort of do the ships. So if you paid them enough, they would take silk to Japan and bring back usually silver, which was in demand in China. So they were the transportation, and they made money doing that. As far as the Dutch are concerned, Bentley tells us after 1639, Dutch merchants trading at Nagasaki became Japan's principal source of information about Europe and the world beyond East Asia. A small number of Japanese scholars learned Dutch in order to communicate with the foreigners. Their studies, which they called Dutch learning, oddly enough, brought considerable knowledge of the outside world to Japan. By the mid-18th century, the Tokugawa Shoguns themselves had become enthusiastic proponents of Dutch learning, and schools of European medicine and Dutch studies flourished. So, again, it does sound odd to us that it would be the Portuguese and the Dutch that, at least for the time, at the time, among European countries had the biggest influence on Japan, but they did. But overall, from the beginning of the Tokugawa Shogunate to at least midway through, or even to the end, the Japanese society, the Japanese government forcing the society to do this, more or less started to close down to foreign influence, trade, religion, particularly European. So that's the general direction that it was going, with exceptions.